The history of Korean rock from 1963 to 1980. This episode, Korean rock renaissance from 1976 to 1980. Hello and welcome back to the third and final episode in this mini podcast series where we deep dive into the history of Korean rock from the 1960s all the way to the late 1970s. As always, I'm your host John, and as per usual, I'm joined by my dear friend and co-host Faramount, who will be the one getting introduced to the music I'll play in this episode.
Hello.
If you want a little more context on what we're going to talk about in today's episode, please check out our previous two episodes in this mini-series. This is the last episode in the series, so I assure you it won't take long and it's worth it. So where we last left off, the Korean rock scene was in a dire state. Most of the bands and musicians who were veterans in rock music, starting all the way back in the 1960s, started to get their music banned, and they weren't allowed to perform anymore or release any records, and some were even imprisoned and tortured during the marijuana incident. However, there were still a few that remained. Most of the leaders of rock groups started going solo and released commercial hits, although most of these wouldn't satisfy the appetite of a Korean rock fan. In the first half of this episode, we'll cover what happened to the old 60s and 70s rockers during 1976 to 1980. In the second half, we'll cover the newcomers to the scene. One band that managed to release their first album in 1976 was Seoul Nagune, or Seoul Traveler. The band lineup included Chae-chul from Idol and Inami from Shinjingan and Yeopjeons, both bands we covered in the last episode. Seoul Traveler dabbled in funk jam music, and one of my favorite tracks is a cover of a song called Sunny Day About to Come, which was a big hit in Korea at the time. Here's a snippet. I played a portion of the keyboard solo there. Such a sick solo. It sounds great.
Absolutely.
I always love it when Korean bands do these long jams in the middle of the tracks. You sort of lose that in Korean rock of the 1980s and even up to now. But in the 70s, they were really prominent.
Mm-hmm.
Seoul Traveler releases one other album, that being a Christmas record, before turning into a different band called 사랑과 평화, or Love and Peace. Love and Peace continued the funk sound seen on Seoul Traveler, however with less jams and more commercial songwriting. Case in point, the title track on their first album, It's Been a Long Time. As you can hear, they still kept the funk sound while also having vocals and shorter length songs for a more commercial track.
I like the wah-wah.
Yeah.
Wah-wah back.
It's a unique sound, sort of.
I mean, in Korea at the time, surely.
Yeah. Was it used a lot in the West, you think?
It was used a lot in the West. I mean, their whole thing is doing what they were doing in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a big, especially if you look like
Mm-hmm.
at stock music from the time, you'll see a lot of just wah-wah guitars and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Love and Peace would go on to have a long career, and they still perform from time to time. However, many of its original members have left the group. Remember Big Five, who released their first album in 1972? We listened to their cover of Soul Sacrifice in the last episode. Well, 5 years later, in 1977, they finally released their second studio album. This one felt more like the band had more artistic control over their song choices, and a lot of great tracks come from it, such as Someday. Here's a snippet.
지나간 그 어느 날 해변에서 우연히 만나 알게 된 너 잊지 못해 지금도 생각이 나네.
It still sounds like the early 1970s Korean psychedelic sound.
I think so as well.
Yeah, it's surprising that it was released in 1977. It's a shame that this album was released so late. I think it would have done great in the early 1970s, like the whole psychedelic scene there, but being 1977, it was too late for any commercial success. The Devils released their fourth and final album in 1977 as well, but instead of going for that soul sound we heard on previous records, this album showed the band covering a lot of more traditional Korean songs. Here's a snippet of their cover of a traditional song called 신고산 타령.
공산명월 두견이는 피나게 슬기울고 강심의 어린 달빛 쓸쓸히 비쳐있네.
Still, they still have a good sound. I think that's what people call. I think this would fall under rare groove. That's what people call a lot of these old Korean records, rare groove, and I think that would fall under it pretty nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Still got a few funk psychedelic elements in there, but these bands had to be careful with the songs they released on records in fear of them getting banned or not being able to perform live, as they saw just a few years earlier. Another band we talked about in the last episode was the Key Brothers. Key Brothers was a band set up by ex-Key Boys members after Yoon Han-gi left that group. The band initially started releasing psychedelic and even Latin-influenced music. However, in the mid-1970s, the leader Yoon Han-gi would leave the group, same as he did with the Key Boys. The band continued on, however, releasing an odd trot and traditional Korean-based album in 1976. However, the Key Brothers, without Yoon Han-gi, did release a musically interesting album in 1979, although it did turn out to be their last. It might not have been as popular as their early 1970s releases, but this album still shows off some great psychedelic rock songs, such as Perhaps It's Too Late. Here's a snippet.
하늘에 아롱진 구름같이 내 마음 어쩔까 망설이네. 차라리 잊어야 될 것을 이제는 늦었나 봐. 정말 늦었나 봐. 바람에 날리는 낙엽처럼 내 마음 어쩔까 나도 몰라. 차라리 생각을 말 것을 이제는 늦었나 봐. 정말 늦었나 봐.
I love that riff. Yeah. It's quite catchy.
Yep.
The riff they're playing still have a very trot-like vibe, although it's massively overtaken by psychedelic performances and vocals. As previously mentioned, this would turn out to be their last album, and we don't even know where exactly they ended up or when they broke up. But it is safe to say that the band couldn't keep up with all the new bands that were becoming popular at this time. The singer and rhythm guitarist of He6 and the leader of his own group, Black Butterfly, Chae-hun, left his own band around the mid-1970s to pursue a solo career. Although he got quite popular during this solo venture, it seemed that Chae-hun couldn't stray far from the rock band life, as he released a couple of more albums with some new bands that he formed. One of these new bands was called Tiger Butterfly. Note, there is a theme of butterflies in his band names. He is known
Probably
to...
inspired by Iron Butterfly.
Maybe. He is known for liking butterflies. He has said this before, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the group unfortunately only released one full-length studio album. Here's a snippet of the leading track, Can't Do Anything About It.
한번 본 그 얼굴이 내 마음을 사로잡았어요. 빵긋이 웃던 얼굴이 내 맘속에 남아있어요. 설레는 이 마음을 나눈 이 마음을 나눈
Sounds very different.
Very good.
Yeah, it sounds very different from the type of music I've been playing in this during this series. What do you think? Is it more geared towards pop, you think? I'm not sure. I don't know how to describe this sound. It sounds quite unique.
It's very subtly done to me.
Oh.
It's very on that edge of not jazz rock. It's not jazz rock,
Mhm.
but it's a definitely straying more around the like how can I call this? The artsier side of like pop.
Yeah, I was curious on where you'd put this because I wasn't quite sure where this would lie under.
Hmm.
After going back to his solo career, Chan started yet another band called Fire Butterfly in 1983, with that album going for a more traditional rock and roll sound. Again, that band only ever released one full-length album. Someone we didn't mention in the last episode was the jazz drummer Yu Bok-sung, who released an album before in 1972 as a part of Latin Koreana. And he had also played on a couple of different albums, mainly the bongos on a couple of go-go albums we talked about last time. Ryu Bok-sung finally scored quite a big hit in 1978 with his song Myeongdong Street I Walk Alone on the album Ryu Bok-sung and Traffic Lights. Here's a snippet of that track.
혼자 걸어가는 명동길 추억 그리워서 걷는 길 다정히 걸어가던 이 거리 말없이 떠나버린 그 사람 행여나 만나볼까 걸어봐도 그 사람 볼 수 없네 찾아볼 수 없네 혼자 걸어가는 명동길.
Almost sounds like a movie soundtrack, doesn't it?
In a way.
Although he was a jazz drummer, this album shows more of a straightforward psychedelic rock sound with a sprinkling of Latin bongos on the second side tracks.
Hmm. I don't know what gave you really the soundtrack feel. I actually no, I do kind of feel the soundtrack feel. It's very much around like the soundtracks of like the 60s, like
It gave,
don't say
I think it was those
60s.
horns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like Shaft-y. Of course, so like I don't think it's as intricately like arranged as like Isaac Hayes like Shaft's soundtrack, but like it has stats to it in a way.
Ryu Bok-sung continued his career into the 80s, and still at the age of 84, Ryu Bok-sung still performs live from time to time at jazz clubs where he can be seen drumming to this day at 84 years old.
It looks like he's a beast.
That's like a big achievement. It's especially for like a Korean musician where they tend to retire in their like 70s.
Yeah,
Let's talk about the now famous psychedelic Korean singer from the 1970s, Kim Jong-mi. Since Shin Jung-yeon couldn't write and release music at this time, or even perform live, Kim Jong-mi had to look for other songwriters, most of which couldn't satisfy the psychedelic sound she was known for in the first half of the 1970s. Her first album without Shin Jung-yeon's influence, released in 1977, was rather disappointing, as she was singing more trot-based songs. Her voice does get to shine on one track, however, a cover of Janis Joplin's Move Over. Here's a snippet.
난 정말 알 수 없어 당신의 마음을 한 번만 못 만나보아도 가슴 때문에 난 정말 믿지 못해 당신의 마음을 할 말은 하나도 없지만
I think you could pass this off as like a Yupjeon song if you didn't know the original Janis Joplin number, like with that riff.
Yeah.
You could hear there that she still has that psychedelia in her voice. She just couldn't get the right songwriters to express that. And don't be fooled, that's the only track on that album that really stands out as psychedelic. The rest of the songs are just not that good.
Oh no, I don't know.
Maybe
some
you'll
other-
like it. Maybe
Maybe.
yeah. But if you're seeking out this album specifically for psychedelic Korean rock, you would be kind of disappointed. The following year, in 1978, Kim Jong-mi put out her final album. Thankfully, on this album, a bit of her funky psychedelic songs return, although it's still not written by Shin Jung-yeon. Take a listen to First Met on this album. Here's a snippet.
처음 만나 인사하고 두 번 만나 정이 들고 세 번 만나 고백하고 이젠 서로 사랑하네 안 보면은 보고 싶고 만나면은 행복하고 다툴 때는 화가 나도 돌아서면 후회하네 그 사람 너무나
The psychedelia really returns for this album, and honestly, that style suits her voice the most, I think, having listened to an album full of trot music. After the release of this album, Kim Jong-mi moved to the US, where she still resides to this day. There's been almost no contact with her since, with the only hint we got of her situation being when she posted on a fan page about how grateful she was to still have all these fans. Although the source of this message can't really be confirmed as being from the genuine Kim Jong-mi.
I mean, I'm surprised to say like she doesn't pronounce herself more. Again, like now it's very popular in like Western Anglo like music or like
Yeah, she's popular with Japanese collectors, American collectors, all over the world. Got like American reissues of her album.
mhm.
The low-voiced singer in Shin Jung-yeon's inner circle, Jang Hyun, attempted to make a small comeback in 1980 with a new album. Unfortunately, this record would almost completely sever his ties with Shin Jung-yeon, as he sung a lot of his songs without permission and put it on this album. This particular remake of the Yupjeon song, I've Got Nothing to Say, sounds pretty funky. First I'll play the Yupjeon's version, then the Jang Hyun remake.
할 말도 없지만 보고 싶다네
Although I still prefer the original, the funky sounding remake is also pretty cool to have. After this album, Jang Hyun's musical output would be few and far between before passing away in 2008. A lot of 60s and 70s artists and bands later turned to disco during the late 70s and early 80s. Even Shin Jin-hyun did with his new band, Music Power. This Music Power album was the first release of his in 5 years, and it did sell well, evidenced from the fact that this album is quite common still to this day. A lot of the tracks on this album were remakes of his older songs in a more disco style. However, this didn't please some higher ups, and as they still thought the songs weren't danceable enough, I guess. Here's a snippet of a remake of his old 10-minute long track, Beautiful Rivers and Mountains.
실바람도 불어와 덮어둔 내 마음 나무잎 푸르게 강물도 푸르게 아름다운 이곳에 내가 있고 내가 있네 손잡고 가보자 달려보자 저 광야로 우리들 모여서 말해보자 새 희망을
It's a bit odd to me how many times he re-recorded Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, considering like it's supposed to be a bit of an epic.
It's not just Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, he re-recorded a whole bunch of his old songs.
I mean, yeah, but I noticed into like you've shown Beautiful Rivers and Mountains it 3 times already.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All the versions have sort of different vibes to it, which I enjoy for their own little reasons. Shin quickly pivoted away from this sound as the second Music Power album sounded almost hard rock. His next band in the 80s, Three Travelers, also had the same hard rock sound. Although Shin is rarely seen in public today, he did quite a bit of solo work starting in the 80s, all the way to his last album in 2019. In 2009, he got a tribute guitar made from Fender, the first guitar made by Fender specifically for an Asian musician. And in 2011, a US record label, Light in the Attic and Lion Productions, reissued a couple of his older tracks, which introduced many to his music in the West. If that Music Power track didn't sound disco enough, we have way more that we're going to cover. Kim Up, the songwriter slash guitarist who helped out with many 70s band songs, released a disco album in 1979, full of covers such as YMCA, Heart of Glass, Stayin' Alive, and even Genghis Khan. Here's a snippet of that. Very unusual, especially if you remember the previous tracks he played on or was involved with. He6 also went this route in 1980 when releasing their first album in 8 years. The band by this point had almost none of its original members apart from the flute player who switched to saxophone. This new He6 only ever released this standalone album, as well as released one album backing another singer. Both projects were helped out by the original He6 leader, Kim Mong-tuk, as he wrote and produced the majority of the tracks on these albums, despite him not playing on any. The track I like most from this album is a strange cover of a disco song that I've personally never heard before, called Roller Disco by City. Here's a snippet.
내
this song goes on for over 6 minutes.
You know, the disco songs are more funk to me than disco, but I think I like that in them as well.
Really, I
So I
thought
do
this
love
was
this.
just straight up disco.
I don't know. It's not when I think of disco, I think of Sam's. Besides, of course,
Well,
it's a
yeah,
big orchestral
b-
influence. Yeah,
but doesn't disco have a lot of those funky guitar rhythms? Doesn't it?
it does. It
Yeah.
does. But again, when I think of like disco, I think of George Moroder. Moroder, however you say his name.
Many He6 fans ignore this album, and rightfully so, but it's still cool to listen, in my opinion, although it should not be compared to their 70s counterpart. Black Butterfly also released a disco-inspired album, which was the first record they made after the departure of their lead singer, Chaehyun. Most of the songs on this album are covers of Boney M songs. Here's a snippet of Belfast.
웃음 가득한 얼굴 나는 정말로 좋아 환한 미소 진 얼굴이 나는 정말로 좋아 그대 웃을 땐 정말 나는 행복이 겨워 그대 사랑에 안겨서 나는 웃으며 살래
They also released one other studio album in 1981, which was, again, disco funk inspired. These post Chaehyun albums never did well, and that release would be their last.
I feel like the concept of a Bunny M, of all bands, a Bunny M cover album. Well, not
Yeah,
cover album,
well,
but mostly cover
not
album.
cover
I'd
album,
say.
but they also did have the text Boney M like hits on the cover of the album.
Were they that big, Bunny M?
I'm not sure because I'm not really into Boney M, but I don't know. Now that we covered where all the old artists and bands ended up, it's time to talk about the new artists and bands on the scene. A good place to start the story is 1977, when they held the first ever college song festival to brighten up the mood and get a few more people involved in the music scene. One of the bands that got first place was a group by the name of Moo E, a band made up of 3 brothers. However, they were quickly disqualified as they found out their oldest brother was graduating college the same year. Instead, the first place went to another group called the Sand Pebbles, who ironically won thanks to a song written by one of the brothers in Moo E. This song was called What Do I Do? And here's a snippet.
나 어떻게 너 갑자기 가버리면 나 어떻게 너를 잃고 살아갈까
Still a very popular song among older people to this day. A little bit of a side tangent. This used to be my most played song, and I think it still might be because I used to drum to this like every day. It's a good track to drum to if you're sort of a beginner drummer.
Oh, nice.
Sand Pebbles, to commemorate, decided to make one full-length album. Despite the album not containing the hit song they were known for, the record does have some great fuzz on some tracks, such as Run. Here's a snippet.
이끌대는 태양 앞에 우리는 섰네 밀려오는 파도 위로 우리는 갔네 젊음아 우리 가슴을 활짝 열어보자
I love the Sims. Well, not the Sims. I love the organs
Yeah.
and the. I don't know. It's just very late 70s.
Hmm.
It has a bit of not new wave, not quite yet sound, but it has a bit of the how can I describe it? Tighter production,
Yep.
less sloppy production, but also like so rocky
Hmm.
that I love the stuff from that.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice psychedelic track. The fuzz pedal will make a continuous reappearance on future albums we'll cover today by many different artists. The Sand Pebbles were a college band for Seoul University, and they had a rule. The students could only play in a band and use the band name Sand Pebbles for a year before they had to pass it on to future students. This is why the name Sand Pebbles appear on albums from the late 80s or even the 90s. They had a long lineage of students and band members. This rule was actually quite common with a lot of college bands during this time, and many colleges still continue this trend. So what happened to the three-brother band Mui? Well, they decided to make one album before looking for jobs, so pitched their demo tape to various record labels. Sarabol Records in particular took interest and decided to release their first album in 1977. The Three Brothers band was so primitive that their guitars couldn't even stay in tune, and so had to borrow session musicians' instruments for the recording. The band renamed themselves to Sanulim before releasing their first album, and the album was a massive success, way more of a success than anyone had hoped, and so the band continued releasing more records. The song that launched the band into success has already been played a lot during this podcast series since it's the intro and outro music. So here's the second track. It was probably Late Summer.
아마 늦은 여름이었을 거야. 우리들은 호숫가에 앉았지. 나무처럼 싱그런 그날은 아마 늦은 여름이었을 거야.
Great track. Great track.
Great track.
Send me it later.
Yep.
You send me.
Oldest brother guitarist Kim Chang-wan's soft vocals are iconic when paired with the rather simple chord progression. The second oldest brother Kim Chang-hoon, his melodic bass lines really elevate these simple songs too. This album has a lot of fuzz guitar, and that would be a trend among a lot of these early Sanulim albums. Sanulim's second album saw them experiment a little more with their songwriting. The first track is 6 minutes long, and half of that is a long jam session before finally kicking into the verse at 3.5 minutes into the song. Here's a snippet of that section, and remember, before the snippet, there was a whole 3 minutes of this jam session.
내 마음에 주단을 깔고 그대 길목에 서서 예쁜 촛불로 그댈 맞으리 향그러운 꽃길로 가면 나는 나비가 되어 그대 마음에 날아가 앉으리 아 한마디 말이 노래가 되고 시가 되고 내 마음에 주단을 깔고 그대 위해 노래 부르리.
Very experimental songwriting there. I've heard a lot of Western bands that start their song off normally and then go into a long jam session, like I guess Freebird. But I don't think I've heard any where they start off with a long jam session before going into a song.
Mm-hmm.
Sanulim's third album was released the same year as their second in 1978. The record only has 5 tracks due to the entirety of the second side being 18 minutes long. That obviously shows that they delved into a bit of progressive rock as well. However, the member that shines the most on this record is the second oldest brother, Kim Chang-hoon. He even gets the title track, My Heart is a Wasteland, and here's a snippet.
나
I haven't listened to Volume 3. I listened to Volume 2 and Volume 1, I'm pretty sure, but I'm
You
not
might
sure
not
about
have
Volume 3.
heard Volume 3, yeah.
Mm.
The translated lyrics in the main section are, "My heart is a wasteland where only cold winds blow. Grass can't grow on a wasteland like this." And there's a very punk, nihilistic vibe to the lyrics.
Truly.
If you're wondering where punk was in Korea, it simply couldn't survive in a dictatorship. So Korea basically skipped out on punk rock and went straight to hard rock and heavy metal in the 80s. And punk wasn't even really a thing until the 1990s in the underground scene. But if you want to hear 70s and 80s Korean punk, Lim, and more specifically their songs written by the second oldest brother Kim Chang-hun, are the tracks you should look out for. But if you want punk rock, by far the most punk-like song they released in the 1970s was on their fourth album. Their fourth album was actually kind of a disappointment. It was more of a compilation of all their film and TV series soundtracks rather than a full-length studio album. But nevertheless, they shine on another Kim Chang-hun pen track, Express Train. Here's a snippet.
쏜살같이 달려가는 특급 열차 속에서 우연히 보았던 하얗게 뱀빛 꽃 같은 아름다운 여인 해맑은 웃음소리 들들하고 강만 나는 특급 열차 속에서 우연히 보았던 그 여인의 아름다운 검은 눈동자가 잊혀지질 않네 우연히 만나 말없이 헤어져도 내 맘에 남았네 아름다운 여인.
Those extremely high vocals and that don't quite hit the right notes. It was a very unusual sound in Korea at the time, and most people today don't know how to class this song.
Mm-hmm.
Lim would continue to make studio albums at a steady pace. However, not all the brothers would be present, as apart from the oldest brother, Kim Chang-wan, the other two had to go serve in the military or even get normal working jobs, making Kim Chang-wan the only member to be present on every single Lim album. Lim did make a grand comeback in 1997 with their 13th album, but after a few tours, the youngest brother Kim Chang-ik died in a forklift accident in Canada in 2008, putting an end to Lim.
I'm looking at the last Sun Lim albums. The only one that doesn't follow the album cover scheme besides like the one before Four, the like children's album.
Yeah, the children's albums don't really follow album cover scheme, and Volume 13 initially didn't follow the album cover scheme. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's sort of a plain color background with the Lim logo and the album title and what volume album it is, and then on the side there's a drawing made by Kim Chang-wan, and that it usually follows that format for all the album covers. Look it up if you didn't know. But Volume 13 initially only came out on CD, and it didn't follow that album cover trend. It was instead a photo of a bathroom. But in
Go figure.
But in 1998, it did get a reissue with an album cover that more or less matched the other album covers. It had a sort of yellowish color on with it. Lim members, mostly Kim Chang-wan and Kim Chang-hun, picked up a couple of bands and artists to and helped them make albums by giving them songs. Most of these artists and bands worked with the brothers in the early to mid 1980s, with most of them being college students who had participated in various college song festivals and wanted to make an album to celebrate. Although not a college band, one of the first artists Kim Chang-wan picked up was a duo by the name of Nogojiri, who released their first album in 1979 on the same label as Lim. Their first release was full of funky reinterpretations of old traditional Korean songs, such as this song, which was a medley of Arirang, Doraji, and 노들 강변. Here's a snippet. I thought that guitar solo was pretty good, especially that part that goes da 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 da. I thought that was
Mm.
quite fun sounding.
Is it palm muted?
I don't think it is. It's just
No? Okay.
going down the scale.
Mm.
Seeing the potential in this group, Kim Chang-won advised them to add a third member, a drummer, and turn them into a sort of Sanolim V2. In fact, their songs sounded so similar to Sanolim that one could mistake them for that band. Here's a track called Silent Room.
내 친한 인형이 있고 또 내 마음은 자유로워 가만히 불러보고 그대 얼굴 그려본다 방 안에는 언젠가 내리던 따뜻한 비가 내리고 둘이 걷던 가로등길 선하게 뻗어간다 이 조용한 내 방에
Obviously, the songs were written by Sanolim's Kim Chang-won, but the way the vocalist sings the song's melodies, as well as the way the bass is played, makes them sound scarily similar to Sanolim. The two parted ways after their second album, but they never sort of escaped that shadow of a title, Sanolim V2.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when we talked about the first college song festival? Well, that was such a big hit. The festivals not only continued into the far future, but it also spawned a variety of different college song festivals, all of which spawned popular bands and artists in their own right. One of my favorites is a band by the name of Runway, who were fittingly, as the name suggests, a band from Korea Aerospace University. The band managed to release one studio album in 1979, and one of my all-time favorite tracks is the song I Loved You From the Start. Here's a snippet.
그대 처음 봤던 순간부터 나는 사랑했네 그대 반짝이는 까만 눈동자 나를 바라보았네
The vocalist slash drummer Bae Chol-soo went on to form another influential group called Songgolmae after Runway in the late 1970s. This is me kind of cheating here because this album was released in 1981, but the band called Magma's record debut was on 1980 College Song Festival with their song Sun. Here's a snippet of that song from the 1981 album. This could be seen as the start of Korean hard rock and metal craze.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a bit surprising to me how they were so playing fuzzy guitars, and this was 79? No, this
This
is not
was-
79,
this-
this was 79.
Yeah, this was 80, 81 we're talking about here.
81, yeah.
The fuzzy guitars do sort of end in the mid 1980s when the heavy metal groups start to come in. But yeah, the psychedelic rock music still sort of continues with these university bands.
Yeah.
Magma unfortunately only left one studio album, but I would have loved to hear more from them. In fact, most of these college song festival bands and artists only ever released one full-length studio album, since they saw it more of as a commemorative thing rather than starting a whole musical career, and they just got normal jobs after releasing that one album.
Mhm.
I'm just scratching the surface here, but these college song festivals spawned so many artists and bands. A lot of them, I don't even think I'm qualified enough to do them justice in this episode. But this started a trend where amateurish musicians were getting popular rather than the well-trained and highly experienced US Army-based musicians of the past. More and more new bands showed up in the Korean rock scene. Tulgukha took over the 1980s with their rock and folk sounds, inspired by the likes of the Beatles. And also during this time, heavy metal was getting really popular with bands like Shinawi. Entering the 1990s, rock went more underground with punk bands like No Brain, Crying Nut, and Lazy Bone getting quite popular during the turn of the century. Which leads us to the final point. Was rock ever popular in Korea? In the 1960s and 1970s, the mainstream music scene was dominated by trot and old pop music. In the late 1970s and 1980s, it does seem like they were in the mainstream, but you gotta remember, before the 1988 Seoul Olympics, people didn't think it was cool to listen to Korean rock when you could listen to many of the better Western rock bands. And just when Korean rock could shine in the 1990s, K-pop groups started to emerge, and that's where Korean rock is still today. The underground scene is quite exciting if you know where to look, but from the outside, Korean music just looks like K-pop. This was why I wanted to make this podcast, to show people that Korean rock existed in the 1960s and 70s, just like the West. I'm still a big fan of Western music from that time, and honestly it was a shock to see how hard it was for me to find out about Korean music during this time, despite me being a native Korean speaker. I know some Westerners are interested in learning about Korean rock, so I decided to make this short series to get the ball rolling and get more people to talk about this type of Korean rock. There's a lot of info, even on the Western side of the internet, about the 80s and 90s Korean rock bands and even the more recent underground bands. But not a lot is mentioned about the 1960s and 70s groups, apart from maybe like Shin Jung-hyun and Sanul Lim. So I wanted to show people that there are more things out there. It's just extremely hard to search for. That was the end of the mini-series, but we're not quite done yet. After listening to this podcast, perhaps you thought it would be nice to own a few of these records for yourself. Well, that's easier said than done. A lot of the original records are not only expensive, but rarely turn up on the market. Some websites have relatively fair prices, but you're still looking at records that go for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Oftentimes, you might not even be able to find the record you're looking for sale. On top of that, add on the fact that most of these sites are only in Korean and only shipped to Korea. It's hard for Westerners to navigate, let alone buy any of these albums. If you thought about picking up reissues, they have their own problems too. On top of most of them only being released in Korea, most of the reissues sound frankly terrible because a lot of the albums have missing master tapes, which means the audio source of these reissues are vinyl rips of the original records with varying degrees of noise suppression on top, which can make the song sound quite muffled and overall terrible. So unless you move to Korea, learn to speak Korean, and have a lot of money, Korean record collecting is just a hard journey. Even just listening to an album can be a difficult task, as most releases aren't even on streaming or even ripped on YouTube, so you end up having to spend hundreds on an album you don't even know what sounds like. Many of the album's sleeves pre-1974 were also built terribly and were very flimsy, and after 50 years of use, a lot of the record sleeves have deteriorated, and it can be hard to find albums from this time in good shape. The vinyl record itself can also be of poor shape, and it is common for a lot of floor noise to be present on these records. Thus, mine and a lot of other record collectors' bar for buying albums are very low. For me, if a record doesn't skip and can play all the way through, that's good enough for me, no matter the condition of the sleeve or the record. Having said all that, there are a few easier records you might be able to pick up on places like Discogs or eBay. First, the reissues. Not all reissues sound bad, and some still retain the master tapes. For example, He6's fifth album, Love Hurts / Beautiful Doll, still has its master tapes, and was most recently reissued in 2020 on Beatball Records. Beatball Records is a Korean record label, but it has since become quite famous overseas, and sometimes you can pick up recent Beatball reissues in the West as well. Another release that is getting quite expensive nowadays is the Lion Production reissue of Shinjingan and Yapjeon's Volume 1. Being a US release, the packaging and the overall presentation is excellent. As I said earlier in this episode, in 2011 and 2012, Light in the Attic and Lion Productions released a couple of Shinjingan albums in the US. Obviously, it's been over a decade since then, and these albums are quite collectible, so the Lion Productions reissues of the Yapjeon's and Kim Jong-beans Now, yes, they did reissue Kim Jong-beans Now, are quite a bit harder to find. However, Light in the Attic has since reissued their Shinjingan compilation, Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, and countless number of times. And the latest reissue was last year, so it's still relatively easy to pick up. Alongside that double LP compilation, Light in the Attic also put on record for the first time a Shinjingan compilation EP called From Where to Where, and that's another good listen in my opinion. In recent times, Spanish record label Gurasen has also reissued the first 3 Sanolim albums, alongside a compilation album of songs they released after those 3 records. Although these have all sold out, they were released quite recently, so pick them up before they skyrocket in price. But if you want the original records from this time, a lot of the original releases can be hard to find if you're not physically in South Korea. But the 2 I can recommend, since they're quite common here, are Shinjingan and Music Power Volume 1. That album, although being disco inspired, still has a lot of classic Shinjingan songs, and Keyboy's Gold, a compilation album of Keyboy's later era songs, and it's honestly a good listen. Also very easy to find. And so that's it, the early history of Korean rock told in 3 parts. Again, the reason I stopped here was not only because my specialty and knowledge stops around this time, but also after this point there's a lot of information online on the Western web about the 80s and 90s bands. I wanted to cover the obscure artists few would have heard about. We might continue this podcast by making a few bonus episodes in the future focused on specific singers or bands, but for the near future, that's all folks.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can always contact us at koreanrockalbums@gmail.com. And check out our other YouTube channel at Paperback Writer Korea, where we post a lot of the rips of the albums we talked about in today's episode.